my initial interest comes from just personal experience and realizing in my own life how valuable relationships with individuals who don't necessarily agree with me were. Being a college student, especially at a more liberal university, there wasn't a ton of ideological diversity. Most of my peers thought like me. I engaged in classes where professors were, would challenge me at times, but largely, in agreement with my general worldview. And I kind of had to push myself to make relationships and find people who I didn't necessarily agree with and engage with them. And that, I think, has just been an incredibly rich and rewarding experience. And I try to embody that with my work with the Listen First Coalition. Pearce and I's relationship is a great embodiment of that, as I touched on as we were sitting around waiting for this conversation to start. So yeah, I don't know if that was the most eloquent.
It was
answer.
fine, Eric, just fine. You're here. You're here just to share your perspectives and to add to the conversation. So thank you for being here. I have a question as we've all been talking this morning, and I want to get much more deeply into the specifics of what you do and how you do and how people out there can get involved in this. But one of the things that I'm aware of, John, you made a point of it in your comments, and that is there is this America that a lot of us don't know about. I think it would bring a great deal of hope and encouragement to people if they were aware, as we will do somewhat this week and in the weeks that follow, to shine a light on that. But what else can, Brandon, what do you see happening that can take what you're doing in smaller groups and still somewhat below the radar and bring it up to a level where people on a national basis say, I want to do that. I want to get my friends together or people in my community. I want to get the whole community engaged in a conversation. What has to happen, Brandon?
Great question, George, and thank you. I think there are a few levels at which we've made great progress over the last few years in helping that happen, and we're positioned to make a lot more progress. One thing is creating and conducting these large-scale events that more Americans have access to. So I mentioned that with America Talks, we have partnerships with a couple of media outlets. And that allows us to actually find Americans where they read. We have a widget, so to speak, that's placed where Americans are finding their news that invites them in to a dialogue event and then allows them to see a wide array through the National Week of Conversation of ways to get involved. Part of how we maximize the amount of eyeballs and people that we're able to find and provide that point of entry to, whether it's with America Talks or other large scale events such as Meeting of America, which I'm sure Pearce would love to share more about. Part of it is also working through relationships. And that means relationships with institutions like universities and corporations who have access to large numbers of people. And it also means relationships with regular Americans. And that's part of the importance of having a community organizing model underlie and undergird the work that we're doing on these specific events. And that's one of the things that my organization Unify does, is provide the training for folks to reach out and organize in their local community in a way that is scalable. There is absolutely no magic bullet. It's a lot of very unsexy work that yields greater awareness for Americans, but it's also incredibly gratifying work to be able to have a conversation with an American who is looking for that point of entry and can find it through, again, one of the many wonderful organizations that are part of the Listen First Coalition or beyond. It's also about how we set up structures for coordination and scale. And so we have a coalition that we call the Bridging Movement Alignment Council as well, which helps to align the work of different organizations. So all these ingredients are part of it, and everybody on this Zoom has a role to play, and in the YouTube and all of the other streaming mechanisms that you have. Everybody has a role. John mentioned that part of my history was on each of President Obama's campaigns. And one of the things that we did there was scale that movement through face-to-face, person-to-person, localized conversation. Everybody on this Zoom has relationships with people who are looking for their point of entry, but they just don't know who to ask or where to go. Everybody here on this Zoom has access to different institutions that could be partners in spreading the word, whether that's a university or a corporation, a business, or a barbershop. So we all have a role to play, and it's an incremental progress, but there are things that we can do that are force multipliers, and these large scale events are one of those force multipliers.
Pearce, what can you add?
Yes. Well, first of all, unsexy was on my bingo card for this event, so Brandon, thank you for that. The idea again of allowing more Americans to know that there's a step they can take. Brandon talked earlier about muscle memory, and I was thinking about that just yesterday as I thought about some of what we may share in USA Today, next week as America Talks is officially launched. And this idea that we have such muscle memory on pointing that finger at them, whoever them is. We all have several different thems in our lives, I'm sure. But for those of us who have come to the realization that, you know what, it turns out I and my behavior are the only thing that I can control. So what can I do? How can I be part of this solution? And to your point, George, of hope, John alluded to my own moment. I think of these moments. Brandon talked about her moment in Kmart. Learn something new about you every day, friend. But more and more of us are having this moment where we say, you know what? I got all sorts of passions and principles and beliefs, but hold up. What is going on at a bigger level here in which, again, we're demonizing each other across differences. We're ripping each other apart. We're fraying that fabric, as John mentioned. Mine, as he said, was on a bus in Africa in 2013. But it was a few years before I realized that there were already so many other folks out there, John among them, who were in their own way trying to bring Americans together across differences. And I'm somebody who likes friends. So I thought, gosh, what if we hung out more together and did even larger things together than any of us could alone? So that gave me hope. And as I mentioned, I'm finding more and more people who get hope just knowing that somebody's trying to do something about it, that we're not just victims of this doom loop of toxic polarization. And so the first thing that this coalition ever did together was a National Week of Conversation in April 2018. And it's hard to believe that this April will be the 5th annual. And then Brandon has already spoken to America Talks, which became the kickoff event last year. And I'll leave it to her to share more of those details as the real leader of that effort this year. But every one of these efforts are about reaching farther and impact greater than any individual, than any organization possibly could alone. Brandon alluded to Meeting of America. And on that, we're trying to get, yet another level of resourcing human and financial capital to make the invitation as trustworthy and acceptable as possible. And I want to underline that issue of trust, because there are many of us who may see something in USA Today or on Facebook or Twitter and say, gosh, that seems like a really nice idea. Let me do that. There are a lot of other of our fellow Americans who have been burned, a lot of my fellow conservatives who feel, quote, burned by times they have come to a table and been shouted down, been castigated, been condescended upon for some of their sincerely held beliefs. And so I'm honestly, learning this as recently as a few hours ago with the team that that we have in the Lexington, Kentucky area, piloting this meeting of America for next year, saying, look, they want to know, who is behind it, what's the bogeyman, what's the agenda. So all of us are really stricken right now with, frankly, some well-earned skepticism and concern about what is somebody trying to extract from me, convince me of, talk me out of in terms of my principles. And so it's incumbent upon Brandon and me and Eric and everybody else in the movement to see that that folks understand the genuine, authentic desire for every voice to be heard, for every voice to come to the table from all backgrounds and beliefs. And whether it's the hope that George spoke of and the lack thereof, or the lack of trust that anybody is genuinely just wants to hear and understand me and who I am, those are mountains that are getting steeper every day, frankly.
Thank you, Pearce and Brandon. There's a great question in the chat that I think is appropriate here. Marilyn Schramm, thank you, asks, and I think it's something that we've experienced. She says, every time I have participated in these discussions and dialogues, the overwhelming number of participants seem to be of like mind, open to others' views and interested in discussions, but very few, if any, are conservative. In contrast to the notion of conservatism to be open to change and to examining one's beliefs. I know that's not only has that been an issue in this bridging movement, that it tends to attract more liberals and conservatives, as you say, Pearce, are appropriately skeptical. We've also had problems, which is obvious, in the realm of diversity. So, and I know that the two of you and others are really working on that. How are you doing with it? How might 2022 bring more conservatives to America Talks than we've had in the past, and people of color?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And I want to connect that question actually back to Shelly's earlier point about political labels. Before we got on this call, when we were all sort of meeting one another in the pre-call room, somebody asked me, would I frame myself as progressive or democratic or left? And I don't generally have a loss for words, but I actually had a hard time answering that question because I don't think any of those labels, even though I've spent many years working in the Democratic Party, I don't think any of those labels really summarize my political positions and leanings. And I think that is emblematic of most Americans. Most Americans are actually not strong partisans. And underneath those labels, whether it's the label as a liberal or a conservative, or it's a label as a particular racial identity or any other identity, we are nuanced, complicated people. And so I think that the fundamental answer to how we engage people across the political spectrum and across different racial and other identities is that we've got to take a nuanced approach. We've got to take a relationship-based approach. We've got to think about whose language are we speaking when we are communicating, and how are we working through relationships in order to ensure that our leadership is reflective of all Americans and the invitations that we provide are reflective of all Americans. We also have a related challenge, quite frankly, where a lot of times the language of those who have had the capacity and the life trajectory to be able to start organizations in this realm have come through a certain socioeconomic pathway. And in our country right now, we have only about 24% of people who are going to college. So that means that we have a large swath of our country who is more susceptible to mis and disinformation because we are no longer teaching critical thinking skills in K through 12. And so these are layered challenges. And at the same time, when we are working to invite people in, we need to have the capacity to work in ways that take quite a bit of financial investment, quite frankly.
Mhm.
When we just use the tools that we already have in our toolkit, when we just put out our communication through our existing social channels and social bubbles, they are limited to the people in our pre-existing networks, and that is a challenge. So what then is the solution? One of the things that we found in our place-based groups in Unify is that we actually haven't been challenged by getting both racial and ideological balance. Why is that? We're able to work through those person-to-person relationships. And that's something that Meeting of America is operationalizing. And Pearce has a great way of saying where he wants everybody to hear the Meeting of America news from, which I will let him share. The other piece is that we need the capacity to communicate through multiple different channels. There's a group of people who are getting their information through outlets like USA Today or through their social media. There are other folks who might get their primary communication through radio or through their church or through their police officers union. And we need to be able to have the capacity to reach through all those avenues. That is something that we're actively working on within America Talks. And that is something that Meeting of America and the various organizations in the bridging movement are working on, as well as having a concerted effort at institutionalizing justice, opportunity, diversity, equity, and inclusion in our work. So I'll stop there and hand it to Pearce.
Pearce, Brandon, thank you. And Pearce, how do we bring more conservatives into what is sometimes seen as a nice liberal movement? And please use that, as Brandon did, for a good takeoff to other nuanced issues that are at play here.
Sure. Thank you, John. What Brandon's alluding to is my conviction and learning in recent years that a conservative, especially, not to paint with a broad brush, but stereotypes exist for a reason, and sometimes there's some truth underneath them. I just put about 15 pages of truth in chat on that. But seeing an ad on Facebook, it's a whole other, maybe if we put one on Parler, but anyway, seeing ads on social media, seeing things even in the mainstream news, although I think USA Today has the most broad-based credibility of any outlet out there probably right now, just isn't going to cut it these days, because we're all looking for the bogeyman and the them. Like, where's the them in this? I'm going to sniff it out and I'm going to say it's not for me, and I'm going to find a way. I see David's comment popping up here, that fear, that distrust is so pervasive. So the way I've talked about it with Meeting of America, and I think this is the direction we're all going to have to go, is that I'm not getting an invitation to come to some proverbial table just in social media or via news media. I'm hearing about it from my pastor, from my teacher, from my police chief. If I'm on the left and progressive activists have not necessarily a dissimilar aversion for similar reasons, I'm hearing it from my social justice activist leader. I'm hearing about it from somebody I trust. That person, by being somebody I trust, is validating that this is, I hate to use the cliche, and I certainly wouldn't with conservatives, but a safe space. This is a place that I can show up and not be shouted down. I'm going to listen with curiosity, and I'm going to trust that the other people at the table are going to do the same. And we have been so daggum harsh to one another across all lines of difference in recent years and decades here, that who wants to do that? I mean, I think we can all, regardless of our perspectives, put ourselves in the shoes of someone who is used to being told that they're stupid, they're a bigot, they're wrong, they're this, that, and the other pejorative, and say, just what human with any realm of logic or self-preservation would want to show up and subject themselves to that? We wouldn't. Of course we wouldn't. So, John, to your pointed question, there again, a lot of people really want to nerd out on this. I've pulled together wisdom mostly from others that I put in chat a few minutes ago. But a couple things to note, since this seems of interest to folks, is that, my fellow conservatives, and I still feel this myself, let's nerd out for a second, neophobic versus neophilic. So whether it's a food or a foreign place or a new experience, I'm kind of like, I don't know. I kind of like what's comfortable to me. I kind of like what's familiar. And that goes for hanging out with a bunch of strangers too. I think we all probably could recognize that stereotypically, the liberal mindset is one that is more excited and open and enthralled with new, may I say, strange experience, things that are unfamiliar. And so that's one thing. The other thing I like to point out, and I want to cite Liz Joyner down in Tallahassee, who's done heroic work with Village Square. She said, Pearce, I find that a lot of conservatives are kind of all set with their community. Maybe they have a small group Bible study. Maybe they have a tight-knit business community or Rotary Club. Maybe they have their traditional nuclear family. They're just not all that interested in, meeting a bunch of strangers and making new friends. So there's some kind of DNA biology and psychology there. There's some, social cultural structures. But what I always come back to, and people on this call have heard me say it many times, and even though he's not in office anymore, I'm going to use it to be provocative. If we are trying to mend the frayed fabric of America without the 40% who support Donald Trump, that's just not how math works. I mean, good luck. What are we even doing? We're just creating our own little silo. So to some extent, honestly, just to be extremely pragmatic about it, there is some line in which, I don't know, 1% of the country believes a certain thing, and that can kind of be, put over in a corner and marginalized, using that, term technically. I'm still skeptical about that, frankly, because it festers and we've seen what can happen there. But whatever that line is, the people that are ardent supporters of President Trump, the people that believe the election was stolen, that number of our fellow Americans is way over that line. So if we're not engaging them, if we are not inviting them with genuine welcome and curiosity to the table, then we're not doing anything.
Thank you, Pearce and Brandon. As I'm listening to this question of how do we, and which is the question that you three and John and Margot are engaged in a long-term dialogue. But I've always felt that conversation or dialogue goes a certain distance. But I've got a wealth of experience in what used to be called the transformational education movement. And one of the things that we learned is that one of the biggest ways of getting people together was to give them a common task that wasn't just about talking. It was about doing things together. And in the process of doing, conversations happen naturally because the doing allows a bridge of experience and trust to begin to show up. So it's a question I have actually about the whole concept of bridging, because when we talk about bridging, we automatically point out that there's a divide. So I don't have an answer to this, but I did have the privilege of spending 7 or 8 years of my life traveling around the world, leading these kinds of interactive experiential programs. And I was amazed at the amount of connection people could form in just a couple of days of being given common things to do that they could interact on. So I wonder if there isn't another division or an increasing division of the work that you are both doing, these America Talks and the National Week of Conversation. Maybe there's a way of introducing experiential engagement, more of that into it, that could indeed bring people together with greater openness and less, because I know from my own life, it's very hard to have a simple conversation without that muscle memory that both of you have been talking about, and the assumption that the people I'm beginning to talk about aren't reachable. So I go in with that locked into my brain sometimes. What do you think about experiential plus conversation?
Yeah, it's already there, George.
Is
We're
it?
doing it.
Good.
It's happening. Yeah. So there is a lot of research that, or some research that shows that coming together to do a thing helps people create those connective bonds. And I know we just have a couple minutes before we switch to the after chat. So I want to try to connect a few.
We have time, plenty. Just go ahead.
Okay. So I want to grab Deanna's comment from the chat because I think it's relevant and connects to a couple of other pieces that have been elevated here. So Deanna was asking, what was the most effective part of our listening process? So I'm going to just put that question here. And then I want to go back to what we were talking about with regard to inviting people in. And to your point, George, a lot of people do not find the invitation to bridge as a resonant invitation, because a simplification and oversimplification is that many folks on the left hear that means I need to compromise my values, and many people on the right, to Pearce's earlier point here, I'm going to be skewered, drawn, and quartered. So one of the things that we found is actually more effective is to invite people to solve a challenge, to improve the community, to do a thing. One of the things that we say about our unified grassroots teams is that we're engaging around everything from how you come together to build a community garden to pass federal legislation. And so when we take the conversation out of bridging as the thing, right? That's sort of our internal dialogue of what we're trying to get done, and rather tap into people's shared self-interest and bring them together around doing something. That's a wonderful point of entry. It doesn't mean the bridging point of entry is bad or we shouldn't use that language ever. It just means that from a community organizing standpoint, when we create the most different points of entry possible and the most different kinds of invitations, we're able to engage a broader swath of people. To the point about how do people actually go through that listening journey and then change, I want to go back to this conversation around the different parts of the political spectrum and the different labels in our existing muscle memory. As we've talked about, we have a lot of muscle memory around fighting and pointing. And we also have a lot of muscle memory around earnestly trying to solve these challenges in ways that create what social psychologists call backlash effect. And what I mean by that is that if I come to you and say, here are all my facts about my deeply held belief that I think you really need to know to make the world okay and to make us all safe and be able to thrive, whether it's my friends on the right who are coming at that with one set of information, or my friends on the left who are coming with a completely different set of information. In my own lived experience, those real human beings that I'm referencing share my values, are people that I grew up with, are people that want their families to be safe, want their friends to be safe. And so if we're able to bring people together in a way that leverages the ability of behavioral science-based principles to give us some practices to, rather than starting with our facts, which creates backlash effect, meaning it creates a situation in which you think A, I come at you saying B is what you need to think. The implication there, and this goes back to what you were saying at the beginning, George, is that whatever you thought previously, A, is either wrong or stupid or both. So people dig their heels into that belief and the conversation is over before it starts. Mm-hmm. So rather, we are able, through these listening events and through these conversation events, to help train people, whether it's in an America Talks context, just by giving some norms that help set the frame for the conversation in a conversation guide, or whether it's conducting a full training, which is something that my organization and others also do. We're able to help give people the tools to find that connection, to help others talk out loud through their own cognitive dissonance. And we have cognitive dissonance. People are messy. We hold values that may or may not align with all of our actions. We do things, we hold things in our heads and in our hearts that are contradictory. That's how humans are. Most of our decision making, 40 to 90%, is actually driven by emotion. Hari Han, who is a researcher who has done a lot of work on how to bring people together to create social change, says that belonging comes before belief. So if we're able to take these concepts together, which we're able to do in conversation settings, and then connect them to shared action, we're able to create a context which marries what you shared, George, about bringing people together to do a thing, with also developing new skill sets and new muscle memory around how to interact and how to achieve a better world. And that's where that paradigm shift that I mentioned at the beginning sort of comes in. I feel like our democracy is at a place where it's been before. Our democracy over the years has been kind of like a snake that periodically sheds its skin, right? We have a moment where the existing way that we're working our nascent democracy doesn't fit quite right anymore. And we need to expand access to it to more people. Or in the case right now, I think help better connect people who feel alienated, who feel like their government isn't talking to them, for them, or about them, to connect them back to each other and to the democratic process so that we can evolve it, shed that skin, and take it to the next level of evolution, the next paradigm, where the way that we achieve justice is no longer by planting the bloody flag, but rather by coming together across our common humanity.
Thanks, Brendan. Pearce, where are you on this? This idea of experiential interaction, or other ways or complementary ways that you're already doing, perhaps, to bring people together.
Yeah, George, as Brandon said, certainly your experience and intuition are right on. If you and I are doing something together, I don't care if we're painting the fence or cheering for the same sports team or whatever, we're going to bond at a different and ultimately deeper level than just talking. And I, should slap myself for even saying that, because we all certainly acknowledge that, as Brandon said, seeing humanity across difference in conversation is not to be minimized, is not to be shrugged off at all. That is, I think, Brandon's absolutely right that for some people, it's not the right first step because it just is not a resonant invitation. But for other people, it's the only first step, because I'm not going to commit to doing something with you for a half hour if I can't even stomach being in your presence. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, in some ways, we're that far. Some of us are that far now that just to be in each other's presence and to say, would you believe it? George didn't have two heads and fangs and horns coming out. He was a human being just like me. And he has, maybe children or life experiences or a job or what have you. That basic, there's all sorts of science about it in contact theory, the idea that, I'll keep picking on you, George, that if I have a conversation with George and maybe he voted for somebody that I find repugnant, but we have a good interaction. We connect as humans. Contact theory tells us that I'm not only going to be warmer towards George, but I'm now going to have a warmer, softer view of that group, that out group that George represents, and has kind of punctured my my horrific views and judgments and stereotypes of. So that idea of seeing humanity across difference is what it's all about. But again, if we can go from that, or even just begin with doing something together, what are our shared interests? What are our shared goals? How can we address this area of shared concern together? Then that is going to, almost accidentally, as you noted, George, and indirectly bond us as people across differences while doing something together. And to your direct question about where that's happening, Brandon gave great examples of how her work with Unify and the work she's done for many years at the community level is doing that. At this larger scale, one of the innovations we're trying on kind of the next big thing, Meeting of America, is going very deliberately from an initial conversation where we're connecting, then a second conversation where we're going to get a little deeper, and what can we commit to? How can we examine our shared national values, values that would bond us together more interpersonally? And then finally, a third conversation around champion. What are some areas of shared concern that are not restricted to my tribe or your tribe, but where there may be something approaching a supermajority? And let's get busy on that together. Let's get busy on that pothole in our community or a national issue together. And so with Meeting of America, we're very deliberately, George, trying to take that journey from conversation all the way to action that transcends these tribes.
Pierce, thank you. And you put the, as I saw the slide deck for Meeting of America in the chat. Eric, let me
Yes,
ask
sir.
you something. I have a feeling, well, first of all, you talked about going to a liberal arts school that was largely liberal. But I have a feeling that the younger generation may not necessarily see the world as divided as older generations do and have a different sense of things. I'd love to hear from you, A, your personal experience, but B, since we'll put you on the spot and ask you to speak for your generation, do you see any differences in younger generations, certainly ours, older one, where this division and polarization has happened so deeply, and in terms of working together and coming together more easily?
I would like to say that that there were some improvement, or that my generation were better equipped to be able to engage in these kinds of conversations, but I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think being the generation that has grown up with social media, where most of our engagement is based more on scoring points, getting easy knockdowns of people that we disagree with online, and not engaging in substantive conversations. I think it's just as much a problem as it is for any other generation, if not more. Building on that, I think and I believe the research supports this, one of, if not the most politically engaged generations when it comes to specific issue engagement. We see the current state of the climate and the implications that might have for our future, being among the first generations to be directly impacted by that by the time that we're into our older age. So I think the biggest challenge that I've encountered when trying to talk to friends or get people to engage in this kind of work is, as Brandon and a few other people have touched upon, enforcing the idea that you're not compromising your ideals. We're not asking you to come into this conversation to have everyone meet in some imaginary middle ground where we're all just going to get along and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. You can still have very legitimate differences in ideological views, but I think seeing the person, the humanity behind that view is really where it lies. And one of the biggest developments, I would say, in my life was hearing the late political commentator, kind of a leftist political commentator, Michael Brooks, had a quote that was something to the extent of, we can disagree and even be ruthless in regards to systems and critiquing those, but we should be kind to humans and humanity and seek to, understand the reasons why those people might hold those views. And if I have time to give an example from my personal life, in one of my jobs during undergraduate school, I was working at the rec center on campus, and there was an older man who frequently came in and would talk to some of the employees there. And when I told him one day that I was a political science student, he began frequently talking with me about politics, and I quickly learned that if he was not directly affiliated with QAnon, he was at least QAnon adjacent. And my initial reaction was to sort of dismiss him out of hand, to say, this is a person who I wholeheartedly disagree with in every respect, but I didn't. I fought that initial urge off, and I began kind of questioning, what are the underlying reasons that you hold some of these views? And through that process, found that, as we've talked about today, that there was a lot more common ground there than I expected. He had some very legitimate criticisms of the false option offered by our two-party system of global financial capital, of the endless wars, many things that are, for all intents and purposes, I would consider more in line with my left-leaning ideals. And by inquiring into those, I was able to develop, I think, a relationship with him that was inspiring and opened the door to hopefully go into some more of those experiential processes that George was talking about. You know, once you find those nuggets of commonality, that then provides the opportunity to build something greater on top of.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Before
What comes up for me here, which is fascinating, is that, George, what you're saying, and Brandon and Pearce, what you guys are doing with America Talks National Week of Conversation and Meeting of America, it's like we need and we are beginning to engage in remedial education for our country, because we've lost the basics. I mean, we talk about we need to renew civics, but I'm hearing we need to renew something even deeper than that. And that when we started public education, what was it, back in the 19th century, it had a whole set of needs and reasons that were valid and valuable. And in terms of one of you talking about really reimagining politics, and we've had an organization called Reimagining Education, but I think we're talking about reimagining education at a different level that hopefully you guys are beginning to take to scale. But I hadn't seen it framed like that before. And Eric, what you're talking about here really kind of brought it to kind of coalescing in my mind. So I just wanted to add that in at the deeper, broader issues of not just what it means to be an American, what does it mean to be a human? And how do we learn to live together? And that's what we're about in a country that, at least on the surface, is forgetting and has forgotten. But as you all are pointing out underneath, that's who we already are. We know how to do it. We just need a permission field that has been lost in order to do it. And bless the work of this, whatever we call it, bridging, transpartisan, moving together. Instead of move on, we're moving together. But there is a movement here that still really doesn't have its full name. And I just want to honor and applaud you guys and all of us who are working to that, because I think that's part of the bigger vision and bigger meme that we're all struggling to find and be part of.
I know Shelly's been wanting to come in and share in this dialogue. I just have a question of whether or not, as the week of the National Week of Conversation, or the America Talks program or whatnot, whether or not there might be a day devoted to serving America that would give people a whole lot of things to do that could in fact initiate that. Shelly, sorry, I just noticed. Would you come on in?
Sure. I just wanted to pose not a quick question, I guess. We don't have a lot of time for in-depth answers, but I'm struck in the conversation. What struck me the most today is when we were talking about exhaustion a while back. And I think that we've done ourselves a great disservice by linking democracy to capitalism, because we're in the middle of late stage capitalism. And as those systems start to fail, democracy is undermined, because we keep saying there's nothing wrong with the system, and there's clearly something wrong with the system. And authoritarians and that just solve it for me impulse, we're having a conversation today, and that's wonderful. I think about all of the people who are scrambling to find their next meal, who are scrambling to find their next opportunity for their child, who are scrambling with a car repair that they can't afford. And I think when we look at the interlinking nature of these large systemic issues, that a lot of it is the fact that we're getting too tired to have those conversations. And it gets to the point for a lot of people where they're like, I don't care anymore. Do whatever. Take over the government, bomb that country, build that wall, whatever you need to do, just do it. Because somebody's got to have some answer. And it's the forces that are attempting to prop up this capitalistic system are taking advantage of that exhaustion and that fear.
Mhm.
And the money that goes into weapons and the money that goes into fossil fuels and the money that goes into all of these things. So I think we're actually a whole lot closer than we all think we are. But I think the more we try to link democracy to the system, overall system that no longer works, the tireder, the more alienated, the more lied to people feel. And when they feel like they've been lied to or someone's not telling them the truth, they start looking at conspiracy theories, because the mind has to find an answer for a question that it can't. And if they're not looking in spiritual areas or community areas or wherever, and all you are is on the internet, it's very easy to fall for those things. So it's just not simple, but it's a dangerous moment in history.
Mhm.
For all of us who believe in human rights, who believe in the betterment of our community, who believe that we can solve these issues. I would urge everybody to fight that sense of exhaustion, to find ways to renew yourself, to find ways to fully engage, and to tell the truth about the entire system. And that's having to confront some things that we don't want to confront. So be it. The time has come to confront them. Because if we lose the ability to have a democracy, the ability to discuss is gone. At that point, someone else is dictating the discussion. If we believe in discussion and disagreement, let's keep doing that instead of going for the easy answer, for that they're going to fix it, for I'm just going to arm myself and do what I need to do. Because as things collapse, things contract. And that's just what I wanted to add. And to get any reaction from anyone on those thoughts.
Shelly, that's a great framing and set of questions. Pearce or Brandon? When both of you jump in, and George, how much more time do we have for this part of our conversation?
Not a whole lot, maybe 5 or 6 minutes. And before we conclude this piece, I want each of you to also speak to how does this audience support you, in addition to the ways that you've already defined. Okay? So
I'd just like to
Shelley's
jump
question-
in, everyone. What Shelly just said is so, I think, profound. And the conversation has been so rich that I'd like to take a lot more than 5 or 6 more minutes. I think we've got to the nub of a really profound conversation. So let's flow with this over the next 10, 20 minutes because we're doing some good stuff here.
And Brandon and Pearce and Eric, you have time to stay on.
Eric and I have to jump in 10 for another call, unfortunately.
So Pearce, why don't you begin? You and Eric begin here.
Okay. So much, Shelly, to think about and process. Thank you for sharing that. Honestly, I continue to come back, and I saw Kat and others in chat to it being about us and that human connection. And as long as, to your point, we can keep the conversation going, and hell, we first have to start it because it's kind of shut down right now. But as long as we're able to engage in that conversation, I think we'll be able to, across our different experiences, across our different backgrounds, across our different ideologies, to navigate these large systemic issues, these structural issues. How are we going to live together? How are we going to do commerce together? How are we going to engage in the world together? So that's kind of where I continue to come back, is the way in which those of us on this call and those of us across the country are engaging with one another? Are we extending grace to those unlike ourselves in those conversations? The kind of grace and curiosity that Eric so beautifully extended and then shared with us, with the fellow that would visit him in the gym. Are we catching our tribal instincts to create the division between the in group and the out group, to find our belonging in opposition to the other? Are we fighting that, as Eric did, and instead extending curiosity and extending grace? Then I think we'll be able to, as folks said in chat, navigate these bigger issues together. George, I'll take your prompt before Eric and I have to go. And Brandon, I know we'll add on to this as well, but America Talks will kick off the 5th annual National Week of Conversation. And for America Talks at americatalks.us, it'll really launch fully with registration open next week, but you can go ahead and pre-register now. You've got a choice of a Thursday evening, the April 21st, or Saturday, April 23rd, your preference, to come and be a part of a large, I'm not going to use the talking point, I'm just going to be flippant, a big old pool of fellow Americans that will show up at that given time, and then be magically, based on what you tell us about yourselves, split up into optimally varied groups of 5, or if you prefer, a one-on-one conversation as we did last year. And then, as Brandon pointed out, that second step for those who find America Talks will be that subsequent National Week of Conversation, April 24th through 30th, in which hundreds of our partner organizations will do what they do, the many varied ways in which they bring Americans together across difference, for engagement, for exposure, for education, and so forth. And then certainly if anyone is so moved to support any of these large-scale events, then I would just point you to listenfirstproject.org, and all we do is support the large-scale collective efforts of the field. So if anybody felt compelled to give financially, then I assure you that would go directly to the larger scale, farther reaching invitations to our fellow Americans that the whole field is getting behind.
And Pearce, just to add one piece to that, that's great. The first Meeting of America pilot is happening in Lexington, Kentucky. And what is the date of that? And is that open to people who may be watching or will be watching if they live in the Lexington area to participate in?
Absolutely. And you all can go, I got a text just as this was starting, so y'all can look at it before I do. But at meetingofamerica.us, supposedly the website just went live as we were coming online here. So indeed, shooting for May and June. And what John is speaking to is our first kind of market pilot of this large scale, we're going to leave it all on the field approach. Ultimately, nationally, thank you, Eric. Nationally, we think next year, certainly want to get ahead of the presidential election. We want to have at least 1 million people engaging in Meeting of America. It turns out that you can all learn something today that most of us don't know. The country's divided up into 210 DMAs, designated market areas. Think about where your local news comes from. That's the unit we're using to split up the country. And as John said, the Lexington, Kentucky DMA, those 40 counties in central and eastern Kentucky, are where we're really putting it to the test. When we're hearing about it from our neighbor, from our pastor, from our teacher, are we able, for the first time in the history of this movement, frankly, to have both scale and balance in the people that are at the proverbial table? And using the simple math of that population DMA, we want to get 4,000 in that Lexington area, because that would be proportionate to 1 million nationally. So we're, with all of the greatest political experts, we've got, folks like Brandon who worked with President Obama. We've got Mike Pence's top guy, DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Chris Christie, so on and so forth, because we are really, really serious about creating an invitation and an opportunity and a credibility that gets all of the fellow Americans to the table in the way in which they're represented in the population. So yes, John, if folks are in that central and eastern Kentucky area, please go ahead and pre-register at that Meeting of America website and be a part of shaping and testing what this can be as a true breakthrough vehicle and an invitation to the entire country next year.
Thanks, Pearce. And if you know anybody in that area, let them know.
Mm-hmm.
Eric, any parting comments? It's Rich. I'm sure you could go on for a while before you need to leave, and then we move forward to Brandon.
Just general comments. I found myself caught up in the wonderful chat that we have going on. I kind of missed the initial.
Well, that's been your job. Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us as well.
Yeah, it was great being here discussion was incredible, and sorry that Pearce and I have to bounce out before the after chat or whatever we're calling it. But
You bet. Brandon, over to you.
Yeah, so just to react to what Shelly shared, I think that something that we're experiencing right now as the country is an elitism problem masquerading as a polarization problem. And I think that's reflected in the fact that many Americans are experiencing a world in which our GDP is going up, CEO pay is going up, but worker wages are going down. And there needs to be an explanation to that. And so one explanation that a very small amount of merchants of division are using is that it's that other person's fault. And that's a real challenge that we need to be able to address. And I think that part of the way we address that is, as Pearce mentioned in his comment, is bringing people together in order to see that other person as a full human being who has the same hopes and fears and has common humanity. Part of the shift that we are sowing seeds for is creating a situation in which people find themselves cultivate the capacity to be true architects of our democracy. Fewer and fewer people are feeling like their government is speaking to them, for them, or about them, and like they even have a place to begin to solve that. I'll use an example tracking into Shelly's point. I have a dear friend who I grew up with who drives a UPS truck. Had a lovely conversation with him the other weekend where he shared with me his vote history over his adult life. And pretty much in every election, he toggled back and forth, every presidential election in which he voted, and he did vote in all of them, toggled back and forth between the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate. So with the whole history ending most recently with he voted for Obama and he voted for Trump. He's not alone. And what he shared to me in the rationale for that was, no matter which one has been in office, my life hasn't gotten any better. So Obama was in office, my life didn't get any better, and try the other guy out. A lot of us, I think, because of how much time we spend thinking and talking about this, and because of the divisions in our country around class and education and geography and the bubbles that we find ourselves in, project onto folks, project onto those number of Trump voters that Pearce mentioned that need to be part of the solution. We project why it might be that they're voting in a way that we don't agree with, when in reality, they're voting in a way or not voting at all that we don't agree with for the same exact reasons why we are participating or why we are voting in the way that we are voting. And so if we can get underneath that, we can get underneath some of the structural challenges that we have and evolve them together. And just to speak a little bit more explicitly to the point about capitalism, everything that I just shared is also related to that point, but to be a little more explicit about it. I think one of the magic pieces, I shared when I was pushed to share my political partisanship, I said left of left. That being said, I think that one of the magic pieces of the American experiment is the degree to which we have tempered capitalism with policies that allow more and more people to have access to full thriving over time. And we've also seen that not be a linear path. We've seen it go up and down. And I think a lot of folks now, perhaps a lot of a lot of people certainly that I am in communication with feel that challenge that we're having right now, where some Americans, a smaller and smaller amount of Americans are feeling economic prosperity, and a larger and larger are feeling that they're falling behind. So that's something that we need to right size, right? That's something that we need to fix. And I think that speaks to the need to come together so that we can evolve our democracy and our economic system together. So I'll stop there for now.
As I listen, I'm also aware that, and this is my drum that I beat most of the time. I'm also aware that we keep expecting someone else to do all of this for us. And that's one of the reasons that, like ping pong balls, we go back and forth between the left and the right. I'm just hoping that eventually we will wake up to realize that this is an age of self-empowerment, that this is a time where we need to do more ourselves to make the difference, rather than sitting on our derrieres between each 4 or 2 year election cycle. That doesn't apply clearly, Brandon, to you or Pearce or the incredible number of people that are out there that are really putting in the hard work every single day. But I'm talking to all of us as viewers. We have to stop thinking that democracy is some sort of a spectator sport. It's not. We have an obligation, a responsibility to get in and, as Buckminster Fuller says, become the architects of the future instead of its victims. So that's a point that I don't want to go on past, And to a lot that you've been saying, that Shelly and Pearce and all of us have been talking about. A friend of mine is a poet by the name of Mark Nepo, and Mark says, what we reach for may be different, but what makes us reach is the same. And that's the conversation that I think we need to have a heck of a lot more of. And that's why I'm so supportive and grateful for the work that you, Brandon, and Pearce are doing. Tell us, Pearce had a recommendation of how we can get involved. Are there other ways that we can get involved and support what you're doing?
George, I'm going to jump in before you answer that, Brandon, and you may be saying the same thing. There's a website that we have called citizenconnect.us. And it's a way for anyone to find out what's in this field, what's going on, how you can join an organization. And we're hoping before too long, it will also be a portal for what any American can do around protecting democracy. So take a look at that website, citizenconnect.us. And Brandon, back over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So, George, I want to quickly just speak to what you shared about, the need for us to take an active role in our democracy, to be architects of our democracy, and in connection to what Shelly shared before about the exhaustion. It can be very overwhelming, the times that we live in. Your intro very dramatically listed some of the overwhelming features that we are inundated with in our day-to-day lives, in terms of what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening with our own democracy, climate change, the list goes on. And so just from a behavioral science standpoint and from a human standpoint, personally, I shared with John yesterday, I do this work so I won't be curled up under my bed in the fetal position twitching, essentially, with overwhelm from all these things. And from a behavioral science standpoint, a lot of what happens when there are big problems that feel far away is we get paralyzed or we go do something else. And that's just human. That's natural. There's nothing wrong with you if you feel that way. Like, how is my tiny little thing going to make a difference? So what I want to do is assure you that your tiny little thing isn't tiny and it will make a difference. And we need it. Every tiny little conversation has an incredible ripple effect. one person who came to our America Talks infrastructure event was moved by her conversation to join her local planning board. This is how we actually change people's lives. John used the phrase remedial education. And in a way, that's true. In a way, we've lost our critical thinking training in our K through 12 education. We've lost, and you can see this in the research of Hari Han as well, we've lost many of the civic pieces of civic infrastructure that regular Americans used to have. And so how do we replace those? Each one of you can be part of replacing those. And when you connect into this constellation of organizations, your one effort can create enormous scale. Okay, so how do you do that? Mechanically, as John mentioned, Citizen Connect is a way to find events that are coming up. I've also placed my email into the chat. If you want to do more than send an event, attend an event. If you want to do more than attend an event, if you want to find out how do I get my sleeves rolled up a little bit further and get involved in my local community, or get involved with actually engaging my network, whether that's an organization or your book club, I'll tell a quick little aside that I'm so excited about. We're doing an event with a partner organization called Unify America and with the Colorado Attorney General's office, where we're bringing together Coloradans. And one of the people that engaged just yesterday was a woman who is 95 years old and has a book club. And what she is able to do to help is to send a message to her book club. Well, when she sent the message to her book club that this event is happening, all of a sudden cropped up somebody who has been compiling a list of 1,200 people in their county who would like to come together across differences to make change. So you may be thinking that, oh, I just have a little 6-person book club, or I go out with the gals on Thursday to do this, and that isn't relevant. It's relevant. What we are doing is taking the social fabric of our communities that already exist and connecting it into bridging. So if you would like to figure out ways to get more involved, to join in with an organization as a volunteer, please additionally feel free to reach out to me directly, and I can help get you connected in. Citizen Connect is a great online way to get a menu of different organizations and actions that are happening. I will also place into the chat the website for Unify, and we do run trainings that are behavioral science based on how to have these conversations, and we would welcome you in to engage with us. Meeting of America, as Pearce mentioned, will be going all across the country, and so I believe he shared out a website where you can get connected in with that. You can also get connected in with that by signing up on listenfirstproject.org. So plenty of points of entry for you. And I also want to let folks know, if you feel like, well, gee, I don't actually have time, but I have financial resources, or I have a connection with this corporation, this university.
What you may not know is that a domino can knock.
That's relevant too. So I'm happy to help you think creatively about how there's something in your world that can contribute to this effort and help you be a more full part of this democracy. And the last footnote I'll quickly say, because I want to also speak to Shelly's point a little bit more about exhaustion. If you are somebody who is here, who is like, my sleeves have been rolled up, my sleeves have been in my armpits for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, and I'm tired, or I have written the postcards and made the phone calls and I didn't see it make a difference. That's okay. I understand why you feel that way. And we're at a moment when we're moving from some of those transactional things, which actually do make a difference, but can be tiring, some of those smaller tactical things, to some transformational work. And so I want to invite you to rest yourself if you need it, and to come in and be part of the transformational work that might be a little bit more nourishing for you. And again, all of the different websites and emails are points of entry for you to do that. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Brandon. Shelly, Jim, do you want to both come back in, please? Terrific dialogue today. A lot of meat and potatoes, as they say. Jim, Shelly, thoughts?
Shelly, do you want to make just a quick comment? Maybe John, just to round it out?
Yeah, just as a closing comment, I just want to thank everybody, Brandon, Eric, everybody, John, for being here and talking about things that we can do, steps that we can take, the reality that we face, and coming up with creative solutions and ideas to be able to have more conversations. So thank you for being here.
John, any quick
Shelly,
final word?
Yeah, I'm not sure, Jim, it's never final, but it'll be the next one. Shelly, I really honor and acknowledge what you brought up about the systems that we're facing.
Yeah.
And the multiple challenges that are up. And I could actually see that as a whole other Humanity Rising panel, because Brandon really began at the end to try to make the connections between us, quote, little folks on the ground and this big system, and also to kind of tease apart what some of the shibboleths are here and what's real. So I think this is such an important framing that you've shared with us today. And I know it's a lot of what you hold and what you bring to this. And I just want to say, let's do more of that.
Thank you, John.
We have weeks of democracy dialogues. We can certainly focus some really good attention there. Jim, before you close, I want to remind people that tomorrow on Humanity Rising is our 4th day of the democracy dialogues. And the topic is going to be indivisible, progressive advocacy and electoral work. Ezra Levin, who started Indivisible with his wife Leah, will be on. And Doug Linney, who has a wonderful organization called Strategic Partnerships for Activate America. So,
George, I'll just add to that. Activate America turns out, as far as we know, to be the largest volunteer organization for democracy and keeping our country sane, where anybody can do anything from their living room. And it's focused on races, on initiatives and referendums. So it's a way to literally be involved and stay in our living rooms or bedrooms or kitchens.
Wow, thank you so much, everyone. And Brandon, I just want to acknowledge, I mean, your brilliance today and the depth of your insights. I agree with John. And in fact, I had just wrote down in my notes, I want to get you back. And I think a conversation between you and Shelly would be really rich. Because, sometimes there's virtue in a panel of many, but then sometimes there's virtue in a more narrow dialogic frame. And I just have a feeling that what the two of you would delve into, if you were given time and space, would be a marvel. And so I am so thrilled with this session today, George and Shelly and John and Brendan. I think we got into the nub of some real issues that are very deep and not so easily accessed, but have everything to do with the survival of our democracy at this time. So I want to thank you for that. You've done a real service in your session today. Thank you so much. So we'll bring this now to a close. But as George said, we're going to be back. This democracy issue is now one of the meta themes for Humanity Rising, because it's affecting everybody everywhere. And over the next number of panels, it won't be just around the United States, of course, we'll be broadening it because the issues that have been raised here pertain to everybody everywhere. That's what's so extraordinary about our world today. We may be reaching for the different things, but why we reach is all the same. So thank you for bringing that in, George. Okay, everyone, that will do it for today. We'll see you tomorrow. You're welcome to the after session chat group. Bye for now.